The warehouse smelled of rust and spilled oil. Metal pipes clanged against concrete, and someone screamed a name that no longer meant weakness. A boy with broken knuckles knelt over his best friend, watching blood pool from wounds that would never let those legs run again. Somewhere behind a locked door, a girl he once loved sat tied to a chair, mascara streaked down her cheeks, calling out for someone to save her. He didn't move like a boy anymore. His shoulders had a stillness that made grown criminals hesitate. His eyes held something colder than anger. 10 years earlier, this same boy couldn't crush a paper cup without apologizing to it. To understand how gentleness turned into something that could break bones with a single grip, you have to go back to a small apartment building on the edge of town, where a girl named Han Shu-shin once made a boy promise something he never should have agreed to. Jang Ji Shang was 8 years old the first time he heard his neighbor crying through the thin wall between their apartments. Her father's voice came booming through the plaster, followed by the sound of something breaking. Not furniture, something softer. The next morning, Han Shu-shen showed up at the bus stop with a bruise near her eye, covered badly with her mother's makeup. She didn't cry about it. She just stared straight ahead, jaw tight, refusing to let anyone see how much it hurt. Ji Shang sat beside her without asking permission. He didn't say much. He just stayed close, the way a kid does when he doesn't understand the size of the problem but wants to help anyway. Over the following weeks, she told him small pieces of her home life. Her father drank most nights. When he drank, his temper turned violent, and no apology ever came the next morning. She told Ji Shang she never wanted a man like that in her future. She wanted someone soft-spoken, someone who would rather bite his own tongue than raise his voice at her. Ji Shang made a promise right there, sitting on a curb with scraped knees and a backpack too big for his shoulders. He told her he would become exactly the kind of person she needed. Kind, patient, never a single hand raised, not even in anger. She smiled at him for the first time that week. It was a small smile, but it lit something inside him that never quite went out for the next decade. What neither of them understood back then was how deep that promise would run, or how much of himself he would eventually erase trying to keep it. Ji Shang grew up carrying that vow like a second heartbeat. He helped elderly neighbors haul groceries up 4 flights of stairs without elevators. He gave up his lunch money more than once to cover extortion fees demanded from smaller kids at school, quietly, without ever telling a teacher. He learned to smile through insults. He learned to swallow anger before it reached his throat. His classmates saw a pushover. A boy who flinched at raised voices and apologized even when he wasn't at fault. Teachers praised his character in front of the class, holding him up as the model student, the boy who never caused trouble. Bullies used him as a punching bag precisely because he never punched back. There was one part of his life nobody paid attention to. His family wasn't ordinary. Jang Ji Shang's father ran the Fire Bear Gang, the most feared criminal organization in the region. Ji Shang had grown up around men built like refrigerators, men with scars that told stories nobody dared ask about. But instead of training in combat like a proper heir, he spent his afternoons giving these massive uncles deep tissue massages, kneading knots out of backs thick with muscle, day after day, year after year. Nobody in that mansion realized what those thousands of hours of grinding pressure into granite-hard muscle were doing to a growing boy's hands and forearms. Nobody connected the dots between carrying furniture for elderly strangers and building a foundation of raw, functional strength that no gym program could replicate. The uncles laughed at him behind his back. They called him the soft one, the disappointment, the heir who'd rather rub shoulders than throw punches. His own father barely spoke to him, disappointed that his only son showed no interest in the family business beyond errands and chores. Ji Shang didn't care what they thought. He had one goal, and her name was Han Shu-sen. For 10 years, he stayed close to her. He walked her home. He listened when she vented about her father's temper, now aimed at her mother more than at her. He never raised his voice, never once let frustration slip into his tone, even when classmates mocked him for being whipped, for being soft, for letting people walk over him without resistance. He told himself it was worth it. She deserved a version of love that never once felt like fear. Then came the afternoon that unraveled everything. Ji Shang was walking past the courtyard near the back gate of Jialan High when he heard laughter. Her laughter. The kind she rarely gave anyone, light and easy, nothing like the guarded tone she used around most people. He turned the corner and stopped cold. Han Shu-shen stood pressed against a wall. giggling as a boy with slicked-back hair and a chain around his neck leaned in close, one hand braced beside her head. Shen Jingjae, the same delinquent who extorted lunch money from half the underclassmen, the same thug whose reputation for cruelty stretched across 3 grades. She wasn't afraid of him. She was flirting with him. Ji Shang's chest went tight in a way he didn't have words for yet. He told himself there had to be an explanation. Maybe she was being polite. Maybe Shen Jingjae had threatened her into acting friendly. He waited until Shen Jingjae swaggered off toward his group of friends before approaching her. His voice came out careful, the way it always did, worried more about her comfort than his own confusion. He asked if she was all right. He asked if that guy was bothering her. She looked at him like he'd asked something strange. She told him she was fine, better than fine actually, and that Shen Jingjae wasn't nearly as bad as people made him sound. Ji Shang reminded her, gently, of the promise she'd made him swear when they were kids. He reminded her how much he'd sacrificed to become exactly what she asked for. Her expression shifted into something almost embarrassed, almost annoyed. She told him that was a long time ago. She told him she was a kid back then, scared and dramatic, and that she didn't actually mean any of it seriously. Then she said the words that would echo in his skull for weeks afterward. She told him gentle men were boring. She said boys who never fought back, who never had an edge, made her feel nothing at all. Bad boys, she said, were simply more exciting. 10 years of restraint. 10 years of swallowed anger, sacrificed pride, chores done for men twice his size, insults absorbed without complaint. All of it, apparently, aimed at building a version of himself that she now found unbearably dull. Ji Shang didn't yell. He didn't cry in front of her. He just nodded, the way he always nodded, and walked away with his hands shaking at his sides. He didn't go home directly. He walked for hours, past streets he barely registered, replaying every gentle, careful, self-erasing choice he'd made since he was 8 years old. By the time he reached the gates of his family's estate, something in him had already cracked loose. The mansion loomed in the evening light, its iron gates flanked by guards who straightened up the second they recognized the young master's face. They'd never seen that particular look on him before. Something colder than his usual polite exhaustion. Ji Shang walked straight through the front doors and demanded to see his father. Zhang Hongguo, leader of the Fire Bear gang, sat in his study, reviewing ledgers when his son burst in uninvited, something he had never once done in 17 years. The older man's eyebrows lifted slightly, more curious than alarmed. Ji Shang told him he wanted to change. He said he was done being gentle, done being soft, done being someone people found forgettable. He wanted to become exactly the kind of person his father actually was. Zhang Hongguo studied his son for a long moment before speaking. He asked if this was really what Ji Shang wanted, or just wounded pride talking. Ji Shang told him it didn't matter which one it was. He wanted power. He wanted respect. He wanted to stop being the punching bag of every thug in his school hallway. His father allowed a faint, almost invisible smile before calling for the uncles. What followed over the next several days looked less like training and more like a full teardown of everything Ji Shang used to be. The uncles who once mocked him for his gentle nature now dragged him through a closet stuffed with designer clothes he'd never worn, chains and rings pulled from a locked drawer that had clearly been waiting for this exact moment. They dressed him in black leather, gold chains thick enough to double as toe cables, and boots that clicked against marble floors with an intimidating rhythm. His hair got slicked back. His posture got corrected, shoulders forced wider, chin forced higher. One uncle, a squat man everyone called Bald Uncle despite the thick beard covering most of his face, personally coached him on how to walk like a person nobody should mess with. Ji Shang practiced a delinquent swagger in front of a full-length mirror, feeling ridiculous and furious at the same time. Bald Uncle told him to stop apologizing with his eyes. He told him a real thug never looks sorry for existing. The first few attempts at spitting on the ground, at sneering instead of smiling, at walking with deliberate arrogance, came out clumsy and forced. The uncles laughed, not unkindly, more like men watching a puppy try to intimidate a mailman. But something in Ji Shang refused to quit. Every time he stumbled through the performance of toughness, he thought about her laughter echoing against that courtyard wall, about Shen Jingjae's arm braced beside her head like he owned the space around her. That memory fueled him through every awkward rep of practiced menace, until the awkwardness started to fade. Word of his transformation hadn't reached the school yet. As far as his classmates knew, Ji Shang was still the same doormat who let people walk over him without complaint. That gap between what people assumed and what was actually brewing inside the Firebear estate would soon become the most dangerous blind spot in the entire school district. Because nobody, not Han Shuzhen, not Shen Jingjie, not a single delinquent strutting through Jialan High's hallways, had any idea what those years of hauling groceries and needing granite-hard shoulders had actually built inside this quiet, unassuming boy. That ignorance was about to cost several people dearly. The first test of his new resolve came only days later, when Ji Shang spotted a classmate named Li Yi being dragged toward a hotel entrance by two of Shen Jingjie's lackeys. She struggled against their grip, her bag torn half off her shoulder, panic clear across her face even from a distance. Ji Shang didn't think. He grabbed the nearest loose rock from a construction site fence and hurled it at the group, aiming for the thug closest to her. His aim, unfortunately, hadn't improved alongside his resolve. The rock sailed wide and struck Li Yi square in the forehead instead, dropping her to her knees with a sharp cry of pain. The distraction worked anyway. The lackeys scattered, startled by the sudden violence, giving Ji Shang enough time to close the distance and pull Li Yi away from the entrance. In the chaos of dragging her to safety, he didn't notice the ring slipping from his pocket, the sacred soul ring his bald uncle had passed down to him just days earlier, clattering somewhere onto the pavement behind him. He wouldn't discover it missing until much later that night, and by then, someone else had already found it. Shen Jingjie turned the ring over in his palm the next morning, grinning at the craftsmanship, at the weight of real gold in his hand. He had no idea what it actually represented. He only knew it looked expensive, and expensive things belonged to whoever was strong enough to keep them. He slid it onto his finger and wore it to school like a trophy. When Ji Shang realized what had happened, cold dread settled into his stomach. That ring wasn't decoration. It carried the weight of his uncle's trust, a piece of family history that had survived generations of gang leadership. Losing it felt like losing a piece of his own spine. He searched the school grounds for 2 days before Shen Jingjie found him first. Shen Jingjie cornered him near the gymnasium with 4 of his friends, demanding to know if Ji Shang was the one who'd thrown the rock the other night. Someone had seen a figure matching his description near the hotel. Ji Shang, still clumsy with his new persona, hesitated too long before answering. That hesitation was mistaken for guilt. What followed was brutal and fast. Shen Jingjie's crew swarmed him, fists and knees connecting before he could organize a proper defense. His new leather jacket tore at the shoulder. Blood filled his mouth from a split lip. Through it all, Shen Jingjie flashed the stolen ring in his face, taunting him with its gleam between blows. Ji Shang stumbled home that evening looking worse than he had in years, bruises blooming across his ribs, pride scraped raw alongside his skin. His father took one look at him in the hallway and didn't ask what happened. He simply told his son that soft training methods clearly weren't enough anymore. If Ji Shang truly wanted to become someone capable of protecting what mattered to him, he needed to accept the syndicate's actual air training, the kind reserved for future gang leaders, the kind that had never once been offered to him before. Ji Shang, jaw swollen and pride in ruins, agreed without hesitation. The baseline testing took place the following weekend in a private gym buried beneath the estate, equipment gleaming under industrial lighting, uncles gathered along the walls with arms crossed, expecting very little from the boy who used to apologize to furniture. The first tests went about as everyone predicted. His squat numbers were mediocre. His bench press barely registered above beginner levels, drawing a few muffled snorts from the sidelines. Then someone handed him a deadlift bar loaded well beyond what anyone expected him to move. Ji Shang gripped the bar and pulled without much thought, driven more by frustration than technique. The bar rose off the ground clean, past his knees, past his hips, locking out at the top with barely a strain visible on his face. The room went silent. One of the uncles checked the plates twice, certain there had been a mistake somewhere. There hadn't been. 100 kilograms, lifted by a boy whose bench press couldn't clear half that weight. Confused murmurs spread through the gym. Nobody could reconcile the mismatch between his weak pressing strength and his monstrous pulling power, not until bald uncle, arms still crossed, started laughing under his breath. He reminded the room of every massage this boy had given, night after night, for years, kneading pressure into backs and shoulders thick as tree trunks. He reminded them of every heavy bag of groceries hauled up flights of stairs for half the elderly residents in the old neighborhood. Nobody had trained this kid on purpose. His entire childhood of quiet servitude had built something none of them anticipated, a grip and posterior chain forged through years of unglamorous, repetitive labor that no conventional gym routine could replicate. The gang's reigning arm wrestling champion, a mountain of a man with forearms like ship cables, stepped up next, half amused, half curious to test the anomaly himself. Ji Shang lost the first round decisively. But something in his grip refused to fully release even in defeat, and by the third attempt, the champion's face had gone red with visible effort, just to keep the boy's arm from rising. The fourth attempt ended with the champion's hand slammed flat against the table. Disbelief etched across his face as the room around them fell into stunned quiet. Nobody who'd known Ji Shang as a child would have believed what they'd just witnessed. But this was only the beginning of just how far that hidden strength could stretch. Sejong Shi, the top fighter at Jiaolon High and a serious judo practitioner, had heard whispers about his quiet classmate's strange disappearance from school and decided to check on him personally, unaware that he was about to discover exactly what the rest of the underworld had just learned firsthand. Sejong Shi arrived at the estate gates that same evening, more out of genuine concern than curiosity, unaware of the training session that had just wrapped up inside. Nobody at school talked much to Ji Shang anymore, not since the rumors about his family's business had started circulating, but Sejong Shi never cared much for rumors. He judged people by what he saw with his own eyes. What he saw, once escorted into the estate's private gym, was a battered, bruised classmate, still catching his breath from testing that had clearly pushed him past his limits. Sejong Shi asked, half joking, if Ji Shang wanted to test that new strength against someone his own age instead of grown men 3 times his size. Ji Shang, still running hot from the day's discoveries about himself, agreed almost immediately. They squared off on training mats still damp with sweat from the earlier session. Sejong Ji came in with textbook judo technique, clean throws and calculated grips, the product of years of formal instruction. Ji Shang came in with something rawer, an instinct built from years of grappling with resistant, heavy objects rather than trained opponents. The spar lasted longer than either expected. Sejong Shi managed to throw him twice using proper leverage, but each time Ji Shang hit the mat, he rose again faster, his grip finding new holds that started to worry his opponent more than the throws ever did. By the final exchange, Sejong Shi found himself locked in a grip he genuinely couldn't break, his own considerable strength straining uselessly against fingers that felt more like a hydraulic clamp than human hands. He tapped out, breathing hard, grinning despite the ache spreading through his forearm. There was no mockery in his expression, no disbelief edged with disdain like the uncles had shown earlier. Just respect, clean and immediate, the kind that forms between people who test each other honestly and come away impressed rather than resentful. That single spar planted the seed of a friendship neither boy had expected, one built on shared strength rather than shared history, and one that would matter far more than either of them yet realized. Meanwhile, across town, Bald Uncle had grown tired of waiting for justice through official channels. He tracked down Shen Jing-jae at a small electronics shop, where the thug liked to flaunt stolen goods to impressionable underclassmen. Bald Uncle didn't bother with warnings or negotiations. He grabbed Shen Jing-jae by the collar, dragged him into a back alley, and delivered a beating precise enough to hurt without landing anyone in the hospital. Then, almost as an afterthought, he pulled out a razor and shaved the boy's head completely bald right there against a dumpster, leaving him humiliated in front of 2 younger kids who happened to be walking by. It was meant as a warning, not the resolution. The ring stayed on Shen Jingjae's finger even through the beating, stubbornly gripped like the one trophy he refused to surrender. That refusal would prove to be his second mistake. Ji Shang finally caught up with him 3 days later, cornering him in the same narrow alley behind the school, where countless other students had once been shaken down for lunch money. Shen Jingjae, still nursing bruises from Bald Uncle's visit and clearly rattled by his newly shaved head, tried bravado first, flashing the ring and sneering about how nothing had really changed. Something had changed, and Shen Jingjae was about to feel exactly how much. Ji Shang closed the distance in 3 steps and caught his wrist before a single punch could land. The grip that followed wasn't dramatic or drawn out. It was simple, focused pressure applied with surgical precision, the exact kind of force that had once been reserved for kneading knots out of granite shoulders, now redirected entirely toward retribution. Shen Jingjae's knees buckled first, then his voice cracked into something closer to pleading than threatening. Bones that had never faced pressure like this ground audibly under a grip that refused to loosen until the ring finally slid free. Ji Shang pocketed the ring without ceremony, stepped back, and left Shen Jingjae crumpled against the alley wall, clutching a wrist that would need medical attention nobody at school would ask questions about. Word of the encounter spread through Jialan High faster than any rumor before it. Students who once shoved past Ji Shang in the hallway now went quiet whenever he walked by, uncertain how to reconcile the boy they remembered with whatever new reputation was rapidly forming around him. That uncertainty reached its peak the following morning, when a fleet of black Mercedes sedans rolled up outside the school gates in perfect formation, engines idling in eerie synchronization. Doors opened in unison. Men in tailored suits stepped out and lined up along the sidewalk, then bowed at a sharp 90-degree angle toward the front gates, holding the position for several long seconds before straightening back up. Every student in the courtyard froze mid-step, phones half-raised, disbelief spreading across dozens of faces at once. These weren't ordinary adults. Everyone recognized the sleek black cars, the crests stitched subtly into each suit lapel, the unmistakable presence of serious criminal weight. They were bowing to a high school student, and that student was walking calmly through the gates like it was any other Tuesday. Ji Shang barely acknowledged the display, keeping his expression flat despite the storm of whispers erupting behind him. Somewhere in that crowd, former classmates who once mocked his gentle nature stood frozen, recalculating everything they thought they understood about the boy they'd spent a decade underestimating. The transformation was complete, at least on the surface, but underneath the leather jacket and gold chains, underneath the terrifying reputation now solidifying around him block by block, Ji Shang still carried the same aching wound that started this entire spiral. A girl's rejection, a decade wasted on gentleness she found boring. That wound hadn't healed. If anything, watching the fear spread across his old classmates' faces only deepened the isolation settling into his chest, a loneliness no amount of respect or intimidation could quite fill. Somewhere at home that evening, an old woman from his childhood neighborhood would look past the chains and the sharpened edges in his expression and remind him of something he desperately needed to hear. But before that quiet moment of comfort arrived, the consequences of his rise were about to strike far closer to the people he still cared about than he ever anticipated. The old woman lived 3 doors down from where Ji Shang grew up, in the same building where he'd once heard Han Shu Shen crying through thin plaster walls. Everyone in the neighborhood called her Grandma Sook, though nobody remembered if that was actually her name or just what people had settled on decades ago. Ji Shang found himself walking past her building that evening, unsure why his feet had carried him there instead of straight home. Maybe some part of him needed the streets that remembered who he used to be. She was sitting on a plastic stool outside her door, shelling peas into a chipped bowl, when she looked up and spotted him. Most people flinched now at the sight of him approaching, the chains, the slicked hair, the coldness that had settled into his posture over the past weeks. Grandma Sook just squinted, set down her bowl, and told him to come closer so she could see him properly. Ji Shang hesitated, half expecting fear or judgment. Instead, she reached up and took his face in both hands, turning it gently toward the streetlight. She told him his clothes looked ridiculous. She told him the chains made noise like a startled cat every time he moved. Then her expression softened, and she said something that cracked straight through the armor he'd spent weeks constructing. She told him eyes never lie, no matter what a person wears on the outside. She said his were still the same eyes that used to carry her groceries up 4 flights without ever once complaining, still soft underneath whatever hardness he was trying to wear like armor. Ji Shang felt his throat tighten before he could stop it. He hadn't cried since the day at the courtyard wall, had refused to let himself, but standing there under a flickering street lamp with an old woman holding his face like he was still 8 years old, something finally gave way. Tears slid down his cheeks before he could catch them. He didn't sob, didn't make a sound, just let them fall while she patted his hand and told him gentleness wasn't something people could actually erase, no matter how hard they tried to bury it under gold chains and hard stares. She sent him home with a bag of shelled peas and a warning to eat something proper, since he'd clearly been living on stress and bad decisions lately. That walk home felt different than any other since the courtyard confrontation. Lighter somehow, even though nothing about his circumstances had actually changed. He wouldn't get long to sit with that fragile comfort. 2 days later, Shen Jingjae made his move, driven less by strategy than by pure desperation. His reputation had collapsed entirely since the alley beating. Lackeys who once followed his every order now avoided eye contact in the hallways. Even his own crew had started keeping distance, unwilling to be associated with someone the Firebear gang had personally humiliated twice. Desperate men make reckless choices, and Shen Jingjie decided his only path back to relevance ran straight through hurting the people Ji Shang actually cared about. He gathered what remained of his loyal crew, a dozen or so leftover thugs with nothing left to lose, and set a trap outside the school's back parking lot where Sejongshi usually waited for evening judo practice to start. Sejongshi never saw the ambush coming. 6 of them swarmed him at once, iron pipes swinging before he could even drop into a defensive stance. He managed to disable 2 attackers early, years of judo instincts kicking in despite the surprise, but numbers eventually overwhelmed technique. A pipe connected hard against his left knee, another followed against his right shin moments later. He went down hard against the pavement, pain shooting through both legs in ways that made standing back up impossible. They didn't stop once he was down. Shen Jingjie stood over him, satisfaction curling across his face for the first time in weeks, watching his crew finish what they'd started. Sejongshi curled protectively around his ruined legs, teeth gritted against sounds he refused to let escape his throat. While that beating unfolded in the parking lot, a second group moved on a different target entirely. Han Shuzhen had been walking home alone, having recently distanced herself from Shen Jingjie after hearing rumors about his humiliating defeats. She never got the chance to fully process that distance before a van pulled up beside her, doors sliding open before she could react. Rough hands dragged her inside despite her screaming, a rag pressed hard over her mouth to muffle the sound. The van sped off toward an abandoned industrial district on the edge of town, leaving nothing behind but her dropped bag and a single fallen shoe on the sidewalk. Word reached Ji Shang within the hour, delivered by a frantic classmate who'd witnessed Sejongxi's beating from a distance and immediately called the estate, unsure who else to contact. Ji Shang arrived at the parking lot to find his new friend still on the ground, refusing help from paramedics until he'd finished explaining everything he'd overheard during the attack. Between gritted teeth, Sejongshi relayed the location Shen Jingjie's crew had mentioned, an old warehouse district near the river, along with the detail that mattered most. They had Han Shushen too. Something inside Ji Shang went very quiet and very cold. Li Yi arrived at the scene minutes later, having heard the commotion through the school's rumor network faster than official news could travel. She found Ji Shang crouched beside Sejongshi, jaw tight, hands curled into fists that trembled with barely restrained fury. She didn't ask questions. She simply pulled out her phone and started tracking cell signals, a skill she'd developed through years of competitive gaming that required real-time coordination and quick data processing. Within minutes, she'd triangulated a rough location matching the warehouse district Sejongshi had mentioned. Ji Shang told her to stay back, that this wasn't her fight. Li Yi refused outright. She reminded him, voice steady despite the danger, that she was the only one who could track the exact building fast enough to matter, and that arguing about it was wasting time neither of them had. He didn't argue further. Time was already the enemy. They arrived at the warehouse district as the sun dipped low behind rusted industrial rooftops, shadows stretching long across cracked pavement. Li Yi's tracking led them to a specific building near the water, corrugated metal walls dented and streaked with rust, a single dim light flickering somewhere inside. Ji Shang approached alone first, telling Li Yi to wait outside and call for backup if he didn't emerge within 15 minutes. She hated the plan, but recognized the futility of arguing with the look on his face. Inside, the warehouse stretched wide and dim, stacked crates casting long shadows under flickering fluorescent lights. Han Shusen sat bound to a metal chair near the center, mascara streaked down her cheeks, wrists raw from struggling against rope that had only tightened with each attempt. Shen Jingjie stood near her, flanked by what remained of his loyal crew, maybe 8 or 9 men total, some holding pipes, others gripping knives with the kind of confidence that came from outnumbering a single opponent. He greeted Ji Shang with a mocking clap, telling him this was where the soft little rich boy finally learned what real consequences looked like. Ji Shang didn't respond with words. He simply started walking forward, slow and deliberate, ignoring the pipes raised in warning around him. The first attacker swung hard toward his ribs. Ji Shang caught the pipe mid-swing with one hand, the metal groaning under a grip strong enough to dent solid steel. then used it to yank the attacker off balance and into a stack of nearby crates. What followed wasn't a fight in any conventional sense. It was closer to a demolition. Attackers came at him in twos and threes, and each encounter ended the same brutal way. Wrists shattered, knees buckled, bodies sent crashing into whatever surface happened to be closest. He moved with a kind of controlled fury that Sejongxi's parking lot beating had ignited days earlier, every strike carrying the weight of every restrained moment from the past 10 years finally being released at once. One man made the mistake of grabbing Han Shu-shen's chair, threatening to use her as a shield. Ji Shang closed the distance faster than the man could process, wrenching his arm back at an angle that dropped him screaming to the concrete before he could even attempt the threat. Shen Jingjae, watching his crew crumble one by one, finally lost his nerve and lunged forward with a knife, slashing wildly toward Ji Shang's chest in one last desperate attempt at relevance. Ji Shang sidestepped the blade, caught Shen Jingjae's wrist mid-strike, and squeezed until the knife clattered uselessly to the floor. The grip that had already shattered bones twice before found new purchase around Shen Jingjae's forearm, pressure building steadily until the thug dropped to his knees, screaming through clenched teeth. Ji Shang held the position, staring down at the boy who'd caused so much damage over the past few weeks, feeling something that wasn't quite satisfaction and wasn't quite emptiness either. A groan from across the warehouse pulled his attention away. Sejongxi, having refused medical treatment and dragged himself there on ruined legs with help from a concerned neighbor's car, limped through the entrance just as the last of Shen Jingjae's crew hit the ground. Sejongxi's arrival wasn't about combat. His legs could barely support his weight. It was about presence, about proving that even broken, he'd refused to let his friend face this alone. Together, battered and outnumbered no longer, they finished securing the warehouse, while Li Yi rushed in to untie Han Shu-shen, whose relief quickly turned to something more complicated once she registered exactly who had walked through those doors to save her. Bald Uncle and Li Dubo arrived not long after, alerted by Li Yi's earlier call for backup, screeching into the warehouse lot with several estate vehicles trailing behind them. Bald Uncle took one look at the destruction, at Shen Jingjae curled on the ground clutching a ruined arm, and let out a low whistle of approval before getting to work on what he clearly considered unfinished business. He dragged Shen Jingjae up by the collar, stripped him down to nothing right there on the warehouse floor, and shaved his head a second time for good measure, muttering something about consistency mattering in a criminal's punishment. Then he called the police directly, reporting the stolen van used in Han Shu-shen's kidnapping along with several other charges that would keep Shen Jingjae occupied with the legal system for a long time. Most of Shen Jingjae's remaining crew, faced with formal charges and the terrifying reputation of the Fire Bear gang now fully confirmed, turned on him almost immediately, offering statements to police in exchange for lighter sentences of their own. The loyalty he'd commanded through fear evaporated the moment real consequences arrived. Han Shu-sen sat wrapped in a blanket near the warehouse entrance, watching Ji Shang from a distance while paramedics checked Sejongxi's legs. She kept glancing at him, searching for some opening to speak, to apologize, to explain herself. He never gave her that opening. He helped load Sejongxi into an ambulance, checked briefly on Li Yi's well-being, and left the warehouse without a single word directed her way. That silence hurt more than anything he could have said. In the weeks following the warehouse incident, Ji Shang's reputation solidified into something the entire district now openly acknowledged. Students who once ignored him entirely now went out of their way to avoid his path in the hallways. Teachers who used to praise his gentle nature now simply avoided calling on him altogether, uncertain how to address the transformation everyone could see, but nobody dared discuss directly. His father, watching the fallout from a distance, decided the time had come for a final step in solidifying his son's new identity. Zhang Hongbo summoned Ji Shang to the villa rooftop one quiet evening, a metal burn barrel already lit and waiting near the edge overlooking the city skyline. Inside, a stack of folders sat prepared, each one containing years of accumulated certificates, model citizenship awards, community service recognitions, academic honors for good behavior and conduct. His father told him these documents represented a version of himself that no longer served any purpose. If Ji Shang truly intended to walk this new path, he needed to release his grip on the old one entirely, not just in behavior, but in the physical remnants that still tied him to it. Ji Shang stood at the barrel's edge, flipping through folder after folder of a childhood spent chasing an ideal that had ultimately meant nothing to the person it was built for. Somewhere in that stack sat a certificate for perfect attendance from the same year he'd first made his promise to Han Shu-sen. His hands shook slightly as he fed the papers into the flames, one folder after another, watching years of careful, gentle effort curl into ash and drift upward into the night sky. By the time the barrel emptied, something in his chest had gone eerily still. Not peaceful exactly. More like a door closing on a room he no longer had any reason to enter. His father watched the entire ritual without comment, though something like quiet approval flickered briefly across his usually unreadable expression before he turned and walked back inside, leaving his son alone with the smoke and the skyline. Back at school, a different kind of shift was already in motion. Lee Dubo, the reigning top boss of Jialan High, had been observing Ji Shang's rise with far more interest than he let on publicly. Unlike most students, fear wasn't his primary reaction. Calculation was. Lee Dubo had grown tired of managing the constant power struggles and territorial disputes that came with holding the school's top position. He had ambitions beyond high school hierarchy, specifically a long-standing desire to formally join the Fire Bear Gang's ranks, something that required exactly the kind of connection Ji Shang now represented. He summoned Ji Shang to the school rooftop after final classes one afternoon. Alone, no crew backing him up for once. Ji Shang arrived expecting a challenge, prepared for another exhausting confrontation layered on top of an already exhausting few weeks. Instead, Lee Dubo simply looked at him for a long moment, then, without warning, began punching himself in the face, hard enough to split his own lip and send blood trickling down his chin. Ji Shang stood frozen, genuinely confused by what he was witnessing. Lee Dubo explained between staged, self-inflicted blows that this was the cleanest way to transfer power without a drawn-out territorial war that would only invite more attention from rival schools and local authorities. If he lost decisively, publicly, the position would transfer to Ji Shang without contest, and Lee Dubo could finally step aside to pursue formal membership within the Fire Bear ranks he genuinely respected. He finished the performance by staggering backward and declaring, loud enough for the small crowd that had gathered near the rooftop entrance, that Ji Shang had defeated him fair and square. The absurdity of watching a grown delinquent leader beat his own face bloody for political convenience almost pulled a laugh out of Ji Shang, the first genuine flicker of amusement he'd felt in weeks. Word spread through the school within hours. By the next morning, Jang Ji Shang was formally recognized as Jialan High's undisputed top authority, a title that came with its own complications almost immediately. A rival faction leader named Yang Jan, unwilling to accept the sudden power shift without testing it himself, ambushed a group of Ji Shang's remaining civilian friends near the school's bathroom stalls, roughing them up in an attempt to provoke a response and establish his own reputation at Ji Shang's expense. The message reached Ji Shang within the hour, delivered by a still-shaking classmate nursing a bloody nose. He didn't retaliate immediately. Instead, word filtered back through underworld channels to Park Mingjun, leader of the neighboring Chang'an High, and someone who'd apparently taken notice of the Fire Bear Gang's rising young heir with considerable interest. Park Mingjun arrived at Jialan High's front gates the following day, flanked by his own faction, all of them dropping to their knees in a formal display of apology the moment Ji Shang appeared in the courtyard. Park Mingjun explained, with genuine embarrassment evident in his posture, that Yongjan had acted without authorization, driven by personal ambition rather than any sanctioned order. He offered immediate amends and proposed something far more valuable than a simple apology, a formal alliance between Jialan and Chang'an High, two of the region's most powerful school factions joining forces under mutual respect rather than continued rivalry. Ji Shang accepted the terms, recognizing the strategic value even through his general exhaustion with school politics. Yongjan was quietly dealt with by his own faction shortly after, removed from any position of influence as a gesture of good faith toward the newly formed coalition. With two schools now aligned, whispers began circulating about a much larger conflict brewing on the horizon, one involving Moxian High and the mysterious martial arts faction they commanded from behind the shadows of their own territory. But before any war planning could fully take shape, one final confrontation from Ji Shang's old life demanded resolution first. Han Shuzhen found him alone near the school's back entrance one quiet afternoon, having waited days for an opportunity that wouldn't involve an audience. She approached carefully, voice shaking slightly as she finally said what she'd been holding back since the warehouse. She told him she'd been wrong, that watching him walk through that door to save her had shown her something about him she'd never actually appreciated when he was simply gentle and unassuming. She told him she loved him, that she always had beneath the confusion of her own trauma-shaped preferences, and asked if there was still any chance for them. Ji Shang looked at her for a long moment, taking in the same face that had once lit up his entire adolescence with a single smile. He told her, calmly and without cruelty, that he'd spent 10 years building himself around her comfort, her preferences, her definition of what love should look like. He told her that version of himself was gone now, burned away along with certificates that no longer meant anything to him. He said he was done handing pieces of himself to people who only wanted him once he'd already stopped being available. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone near the gates, tears falling freely down her face for reasons that had nothing to do with fear this time. That night, back at the estate, his father called him to the study once more, this time for a different purpose entirely. Zhang Hongo presented him with 2 gifts that evening. The first was a custom dagger, his name engraved along the blade in elegant script, a formal symbol of his confirmed status as heir to the Fire Bear gang. The second was smaller and considerably more alive, a baby Fire Bear cub with dark fur and curious eyes, gifted as a companion befitting his new position. Ji Shang named the cub Jik Shang, and despite everything hardened inside him over the past weeks, something in his chest softened watching the small creature explore its new surroundings with clumsy, fearless curiosity. Bald Uncle took an immediate liking to the cub, eventually taking it up into the mountains for what he called proper wilderness conditioning. During that trip, the cub encountered a massive, scarred wild boar that had been terrorizing local trails for months. And against every instinct suggesting retreat, the small bear charged forward instead, emerging from the encounter victorious, but marked with a jagged scar across its forehead that mirrored something in its owner's own hardened expression. Back home, Li Yi had been growing steadily closer to Ji Shang throughout the alliance negotiations, her tactical mind proving invaluable during strategy sessions about the looming conflict with Moxian High. She invited him to a movie one evening, insisting it counted as necessary team bonding before the war planning intensified. Ji Shang agreed, mostly too exhausted to argue, though something about her presence had started to feel different than the constant tension surrounding everyone else in his new life. The movie theater plan didn't survive contact with Li Yi's actual intentions. Halfway through previews, she pulled out a tactical map on her phone instead, insisting they review troop positioning for the Moxian conflict while they had uninterrupted time together. What started as reluctant compliance slowly shifted into something warmer as the evening wore on. Her shoulder pressed close against his while explaining flanking routes, her focus occasionally drifting from the map to his face in ways that had nothing to do with military strategy. By the time they returned to her room to continue planning in private, the conversation had shifted almost entirely away from war logistics, replaced instead by something quieter and considerably more personal. Li Yi's room felt different from the war rooms Ji Shang had grown used to over the past weeks. Soft lamplight instead of harsh fluorescence, a shelf lined with gaming trophies instead of gang ledgers. She sat cross-legged on her bed, laptop balanced on her knees, pulling up satellite imagery of Moxian High's territory with the same focus she once reserved for competitive tournaments. She explained that Moxian operated differently than Jialan or Chang'an. Their strength came from something called the Magic Array Faction, a tightly knit group trained in traditional martial arts rather than street brawling, disciplined enough that raw numbers alone wouldn't guarantee victory. Ji Shang listened, absorbing details about patrol routes and territorial boundaries, though his attention kept drifting toward the way Li Yi's fingers moved across her keyboard, quick and certain, nothing like the careful uncertainty most people showed around him now. She caught him staring at one point and asked what he found so interesting. He admitted, somewhat awkwardly, that he'd never met anyone who treated him exactly the same before and after his transformation. She hadn't flinched away when the chains and reputation arrived. She hadn't chased him for status either, unlike certain people from his past. Li Yi set the laptop aside and told him, with unusual bluntness for someone who normally spoke in tactical terms, that she'd never cared about the leather jacket or the intimidating fleet of sedans. She'd noticed him back when he still apologized to furniture, back when everyone else dismissed him as forgettable. His strength had simply given him room to stop hiding what she'd already seen. The space between them closed slowly, more from gravity than decision. When she finally leaned in, Ji Shang didn't pull away. Their moment together didn't last uninterrupted. A notification buzzed sharply on Li Yi's phone, cutting through the quiet with the kind of urgency that couldn't be ignored. She checked the screen, expression shifting instantly from soft to sharp. Someone had spotted unfamiliar faces scouting the perimeter of the Firebear estate that evening. Individuals with no known connection to Moxian High or any other rival faction currently on their radar. Ji Shang left shortly after, the warmth of the evening replaced by a familiar tension settling back into his shoulders. The scouting report proved to be the first visible thread of a problem that had actually been unraveling quietly for weeks, hidden beneath the surface of his rapid rise. Deep within the Firebear gang's own ranks, an executive named Li Shiwan had been watching Ji Shang's ascension with mounting resentment. Li Shiwan had spent nearly 2 decades climbing the organization's hierarchy through patient loyalty and calculated maneuvering, only to watch a teenager inherit respect and territory within a matter of weeks simply by being born into the right bloodline. Li Shiwan never voiced his frustration openly. He was too disciplined for that kind of obvious misstep. Instead, he'd begun quietly funding a series of proxy delinquent groups across neighboring school districts, groups with no direct connection back to him, designed to slowly chip away at the young master's growing influence without ever revealing the source of the sabotage. The ring theft that started this entire chain of events hadn't been random after all. Bald Uncle's earlier investigation had uncovered a name, Park Woo-jang, an outsider who'd been seen coordinating with Shen Jingjae's crew before the initial hotel incident, claiming falsely to hold high rank within the Firebear organization to secure cooperation from local thugs. Nobody had connected that detail to anything significant at the time. It simply seemed like another delinquent flexing false credentials for street cred. Only now, with unfamiliar scouts circling the estate perimeter, did the pattern start suggesting something more coordinated, something reaching back further than anyone initially suspected. Bald Uncle brought his concerns directly to Zhang Honggo, laying out the timeline of coincidences that had started feeling less coincidental with each passing week. The ring theft, the hotel ambush, the warehouse kidnapping. Each incident, in hindsight, had required resources and coordination that street-level thugs like Shen Jingjae shouldn't have possessed on their own. Zhang Honggo listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable throughout the entire briefing. When Bald Uncle finished, the gang leader simply told him to keep watching, to gather more before moving against anyone specific. False accusations against a senior executive would create far more chaos than a slow, careful investigation. Ji Shang wasn't informed of these suspicions immediately. His father wanted him focused on the more visible threat first, the looming conflict with Moxian High, before burdening him with the possibility of betrayal from within his own organization. That visible threat demanded attention regardless. 2 days after the scouting incident at the estate, a formal meeting was called between the leadership of Jialan and Chang'an High to finalize their approach toward Moxian's territory. Park Mingjun arrived at the meeting with his usual composed confidence, though something about his posture suggested genuine respect rather than the wary calculation he'd shown during their first encounter. He'd apparently spent the past weeks quietly investigating Ji Shang's reputation through independent channels, confirming that the stories circulating weren't exaggerated street rumors. The meeting took place in a private room above one of the estate's affiliated restaurants. Maps spread across a long table detailing Moxian's territory in careful, hand-marked sections. Si Zhongxi attended despite his still-healing legs, propped up on crutches, but unwilling to miss strategic planning that would directly affect his own recovery timeline for revenge against whoever had crippled him. Park Mingjun explained that Moxian's Magic Array faction operated under a rigid hierarchy built almost entirely around martial arts proficiency, unlike the looser gang structures at Jialan or Chang'an. Their leader, someone Park Mingjun referred to only by reputation rather than personal acquaintance, had built a faction feared less for numbers and more for discipline, every member trained extensively before earning any position within their ranks. That discipline made them predictable in some ways and dangerous in others. A frontal assault without careful planning would likely result in heavy losses even with combined numbers from 3 schools' worth of allied delinquents. Li Yi, present at the meeting despite her usual preference for remote tactical support, pulled up detailed satellite imagery she'd compiled over the past several days, highlighting entry points and potential weaknesses in Moxian's territorial defenses. The planning session stretched late into the evening, strategies proposed and dismantled, contingencies debated with an intensity that reflected just how seriously everyone present understood the stakes involved. A war against Moxian wouldn't be a simple schoolyard skirmish. It carried the potential for serious injury, serious consequences, and serious attention from authorities who'd so far managed to overlook most of the underworld's territorial disputes. By the meeting's end, a rough timeline had been established. 1 week to finalize preparations, gather resources, and coordinate movements across all 3 allied factions before launching their opening move against Moxian's territory. Ji Shang left the meeting later than everyone else, staying behind to review final logistics with his father's senior advisors, who'd been quietly monitoring the proceedings from an adjacent room. Walking back toward his car afterward, exhaustion settling heavy into his shoulders, he nearly missed the figure waiting near the restaurant's side entrance until she stepped directly into his path. Wang Kaiyun introduced herself with a confidence that immediately set her apart from most people who approached him lately. She attended a smaller school on Moxian's periphery, unaffiliated directly with the upcoming conflict, though clearly well-informed about the growing tension between the factions. She told him she'd heard about his reputation through mutual acquaintances and wanted to see for herself whether the stories matched reality. Ji Shang, too tired for extended conversation, tried to politely excuse himself, explaining he needed to get home. Wang Kaiyun wasn't easily deterred. She stepped closer, closing the distance faster than he anticipated, and before he could fully register her intention, she'd pressed forward and claimed a kiss that caught him completely off guard. He pulled back a moment later, startled and thoroughly confused, asking what exactly she thought she was doing. She simply smiled, unbothered by his obvious surprise, and told him dangerous men had always interested her more than safe ones. She said she planned on seeing much more of him regardless of what any other girl in his life might currently think about that arrangement. Before he could formulate any kind of response, she turned and disappeared into a waiting car, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk, with yet another complication added to an already overwhelming week. He didn't mention the encounter to Li Yi, uncertain how to even begin explaining it, though something told him this wouldn't be the last he saw of Wang Kaiyun, regardless of his silence on the matter. Back at the estate that night, Bald Uncle's investigation into the scouting incident finally produced its first concrete lead. Security footage from the estate's perimeter cameras had captured a partial license plate on a vehicle that had circled the property twice before departing. A plate that traced back to a shell company with connections buried several layers deep in bureaucratic paperwork. Digging further, one of Bald Uncle's contacts within local law enforcement identified the shell company's registered address as an office space quietly rented under a name that matched, almost too perfectly, a known associate of Li Shiwan's from years earlier. Bald Uncle brought this new evidence directly to Zhang Honggo, urgency now replacing his earlier caution. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. Someone within the organization's senior ranks appeared to be actively coordinating outside threats against the young master, using proxy groups and shell companies to obscure their involvement. Zhang Honggo's expression darkened as he reviewed the evidence, years of controlled composure finally cracking slightly at the implication of betrayal from within ranks he'd trusted for decades. He instructed Bald Uncle to continue the investigation quietly, gathering enough concrete proof to move decisively once the timing allowed. Exposing Li Shiwan prematurely, without an airtight case, risked fracturing loyalty across the organization at the exact moment they needed unified strength against Moxian High. The war preparations continued regardless, external threats and internal suspicion now running parallel tracks that would eventually have to collide. Si Zhongxi, despite his crutches, insisted on contributing to the physical preparations however he could manage, overseeing training sessions for the combined delinquent forces from his seated position, barking corrections and adjustments with the same intensity he'd once reserved for his own judo practice. Ji Shang split his time between combat training, strategic planning sessions, and increasingly tense visits home where his father's growing distraction hinted at problems he wasn't yet being told about directly. He noticed the shift in his father's demeanor eventually, the extra security personnel suddenly stationed around the estate, the hushed conversations that stopped abruptly whenever he entered a room. When he finally confronted his father directly about the changes, Zhang Honggo remained tight-lipped, only confirming that some internal matters required careful handling before details could be shared. That evasiveness settled uneasily in Ji Shang's chest, a low hum of suspicion he couldn't quite shake even as war preparations against Moxian demanded increasing amounts of his focus. Li Yi, sharp as ever, noticed his distraction during their next strategy session and asked directly what was bothering him beyond the obvious pressure of the upcoming conflict. He told her about the shift in security, about his father's evasiveness, about the strange scouting incident that had happened right outside the estate walls just days earlier. Li Yi's expression sharpened with the same focus she brought to tactical planning, immediately connecting details he hadn't fully considered. She reminded him that the ring theft, so many weeks ago, had involved an outsider claiming false rank within the Firebear organization. She suggested, carefully, that whoever orchestrated that lie might be connected to whatever was currently unsettling his father. The possibility sat heavy between them. If someone within his own gang had been quietly working against him since before he'd even fully claimed his position, the war against Moxian might be the least dangerous conflict currently brewing around him. Neither of them voiced the full weight of that realization out loud. There wasn't time to chase down internal conspiracies while an external war demanded immediate attention, but the seed of suspicion had been planted firmly enough that Ji Shang found himself watching senior gang members with newly cautious eyes during subsequent estate visits, uncertain which familiar face might actually be working against him from the shadows. The days leading up to the Moxian confrontation blurred together in a haze of training, planning, and mounting tension. Park Mingjun's forces integrated smoothly with Jialan's delinquent ranks, months of previous rivalry dissolving faster than anyone expected once a common enemy came into focus. Li Dubo, having formally stepped down from his leadership position, took on an advisory role instead, his years of experience proving valuable during tactical discussions even without official authority anymore. He seemed genuinely relieved to be free of the constant territorial pressure, more relaxed than Ji Shang had ever seen him during their earlier confrontations. Wang Kaiyun made one more brief appearance during this period, appearing unannounced at the edge of a training session to watch Ji Shang spar against Sei Zhongshi's replacement sparring partners. She didn't approach directly this time, content simply to observe from a distance with an expression that suggested she was gathering information rather than seeking another confrontation. Li Yi noticed her presence immediately, tension visibly rising in her shoulders despite her attempt to maintain professional focus on the training session itself. She didn't say anything directly to Ji Shang about it, but the pointed glances she shot toward Wang Kailun's direction made her feelings on the matter unmistakably clear. That unspoken rivalry simmered beneath the surface of every subsequent interaction between the two girls, neither willing to address it directly while more pressing matters demanded everyone's attention, but both fully aware that unresolved tension doesn't simply disappear on its own. 4 days before the planned assault on Moxian territory, Bald Uncle's investigation finally uncovered evidence solid enough to act on. Financial records, carefully traced through the shell company's transactions, revealed direct payments flowing from an account linked to Li Shiwan into the pockets of several proxy delinquent groups operating across 3 different school districts, including payments that predated even the initial ring theft by several weeks. This wasn't recent opportunism. Li Shiwan had been quietly working against the young master's rise since before anyone even realized there was a rise to work against, positioning proxy assets in place long before Ji Shang's transformation had fully begun. Zhang Honggo called an emergency meeting late that night. Senior gang members gathered in the estate's main hall while Ji Shang waited outside, unaware of the specific evidence, but sensing from the tension radiating through the household that something significant had finally come to light. He wasn't invited into that particular meeting, still considered too junior within the organization's formal hierarchy despite his status as heir apparent, but snippets of raised voices occasionally carried through the heavy wooden doors, enough for him to catch fragments confirming his earlier suspicions about internal betrayal running deeper than anyone had initially realized. By the time the meeting concluded, well past midnight, his father emerged looking older than Ji Shang had ever seen him, the weight of confirmed betrayal from a trusted lieutenant settling visibly into every line of his expression. Zhang Honggo pulled his son aside briefly before retiring for the night, finally sharing a condensed version of what had been uncovered. He warned Ji Shang to remain vigilant during the upcoming Moxian conflict, explaining that Li Shiwan's exposure was imminent but not yet finalized, meaning the traitor still had time and motive to attempt something drastic before losing his position entirely. Ji Shang absorbed this new information with a grim, steady resolve, the earlier uncertainty finally crystallizing into clear, actionable awareness. He no longer needed to wonder which shadows concealed threats. He simply needed to stay sharp enough to meet them when they finally emerged. 2 days later, with the Moxian assault timeline finalized and internal suspicions confirmed but not yet resolved, Li Yi invited him back to her room to finalize the last details of their tactical approach before the coalition's forces moved into position. The strategy session that followed carried a different weight than their earlier planning meetings, both of them fully aware now that this conflict extended beyond simple school rivalry into something with far higher stakes than either had initially anticipated. Maps spread across her bed detailed the final approach routes into Moxian's territory, timing coordinated down to specific minutes across 3 separate factions moving in tandem. Li Yi walked him through contingency after contingency, her usual confidence occasionally flickering into something more vulnerable whenever the conversation drifted toward the actual danger everyone would be facing once the assault began. Ji Shang noticed that vulnerability, recognized it as genuine concern rather than tactical calculation, and found himself reaching for her hand without fully deciding to do so. She didn't pull away. Instead, she set the tactical map aside entirely, moving closer until the careful distance they'd maintained during previous strategy sessions dissolved completely. The war planning could wait a few more minutes. Right now, with an internal traitor still lurking somewhere within his own organization and an external conflict looming just days away, this quiet moment felt like the only steady ground left standing. Outside her window, the city stretched dark and unaware, oblivious to the alliance quietly solidifying between 3 rival high schools, oblivious to the internal rot festering within one of the region's most powerful criminal organizations, oblivious to the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. 1 week. That was all the time remaining before Jialan and Chang'an's combined forces would march on Moxian territory, before Li Shiwan's betrayal would finally demand a reckoning, before every carefully built alliance and dangerous rivalry converged into something neither side could fully predict. Ji Shang sat there in the quiet lamplight, Li Yi's shoulder pressed warm against his, and allowed himself one brief moment of stillness before the storm. It wouldn't last long. Somewhere across the city, in an office buried within layers of shell companies and false identities, Li Shiwan was already making his next move, one that would ensure this war brought far more chaos than anyone currently gathered in that quiet bedroom could possibly anticipate. The morning after that quiet stillness in Li Yi's room, Ji Shang woke before dawn with a tension in his chest he couldn't name right away. It took him a moment to place it, not fear exactly, something closer to the itch of unfinished business. The sense that somewhere out there, gears were turning that he couldn't yet see. He dressed quickly and headed downstairs, where he found Bald Uncle already awake, hunched over a laptop at the kitchen table, with the kind of focused stillness that usually meant trouble. Bald Uncle glanced up when Ji Shang entered, then waved him over without a word. On the screen sat a spreadsheet of financial transfers, dates and amounts highlighted in red, tracing a pattern that stretched back nearly 8 months. He explained, voice low despite the empty kitchen, that the money trail connected to Li Shiwan ran deeper than anyone had first estimated. It wasn't just funding proxy delinquents to harass Ji Shang. Some of the transfers pointed toward weapons acquisition, small but steady purchases routed through intermediaries in a neighboring province. Ji Shang asked what that meant in practical terms. Bald Uncle closed the laptop halfway, rubbing a hand across his shaved scalp. He said it meant Li Shiwan wasn't planning a simple political maneuver anymore. If he was arming people, he was preparing for something that couldn't be undone with an apology or a quiet resignation. The two of them sat with that information for a moment, the house still quiet around them, the rest of the estate not yet stirring. Ji Shang asked why his father hadn't moved against Li Shiwan already, now that the evidence had grown this serious. Bald Uncle explained, patiently, that gang politics rarely worked as simply as pointing a finger and demanding justice. Li Shiwan had allies of his own within the organization, men who owed him favors or feared his reach enough to stay loyal regardless of what evidence surfaced. Moving too early, without absolute proof and enough support to prevent a fractured response, risked splitting the Firebear gang in half right as they needed unity most. It wasn't caution born of weakness. It was the kind of patience that came from watching organizations collapse from the inside when leaders acted on anger instead of strategy. Ji Shang understood the logic, even as frustration simmered beneath his composure. He'd spent his whole life learning patience for a promise that meant nothing to the person who asked for it. Now patience was being asked of him again, this time for a threat that could genuinely cost people their lives. He left the kitchen without further comment, heading toward the training yard where Si Zhongxi had already set up for the morning's session, despite his crutches propped against a nearby wall. Si Zhongxi's legs were healing slower than either of them wanted to admit out loud. The doctors had cleared him for light supervision only. No direct combat participation for at least another month, a timeline that grated against his instincts every single day. He compensated by throwing himself into coaching instead, barking corrections at the assembled delinquents from Jialan and Chang'an with an intensity that left no doubt about how much he hated sitting on the sidelines. Ji Shang joined the formation without a word. Falling into the drilling pattern, Si Zhongxi called out, "Grip strikes!" Takedown counters. Formation holds meant to keep numbers advantage from collapsing into chaos once real combat began. Midway through the session, Si Zhongxi called a pause and hobbled over on his crutches, studying Ji Shang with the kind of scrutiny that suggested he'd noticed something off in his friend's usual focus. He asked directly if something new had happened, since Ji Shang's strikes had carried an extra edge that morning, sharper than the controlled aggression he'd shown during previous sessions. Ji Shang hesitated before answering, uncertain how much to share about Li Shiwan's expanding scheme. Eventually, he gave Si Zhongxi a condensed version: weapons transfers, patient timing, the frustrating necessity of waiting for absolute proof before moving. Si Zhongxi's expression darkened as he absorbed the information. He'd been on the receiving end of pipes wielded by men following someone else's orders, his own ruined legs a permanent reminder of what unchecked threats could cost. The idea that a deeper, better-funded threat might be assembling somewhere in the shadows didn't sit easily with him either. He told Ji Shang, with the blunt honesty that had defined their friendship since that first spar in the estate gym, that patience only worked as a strategy until it didn't. Someone needed to keep pushing the investigation forward, evidence or not, because waiting too long for perfect proof sometimes meant waiting until it was too late to matter. Ji Shang didn't disagree. He simply didn't have the authority yet to override his father's more measured approach, a limitation that chafed harder with every passing day. That afternoon, Li Yi arrived at the estate carrying a tablet loaded with updated satellite imagery, her expression carrying a different kind of urgency than her usual tactical focus. She pulled Ji Shang aside from the training yard, glancing briefly at the assembled delinquents before lowering her voice. She told him she'd noticed something strange while cross-referencing Moxian's territorial patrol patterns for the upcoming assault. Buried within the same dataset, almost by accident, she'd spotted unusual activity near a warehouse complex on the opposite side of the district, one with no connection to Moxian High whatsoever. Vehicles matching descriptions from the earlier estate scouting incident had been spotted cycling through that warehouse repeatedly over the past several days, always at odd hours, always avoiding main roads that would put them under regular traffic camera coverage. Ji Shang asked if she thought this connected to Li Shiwan's operation. Li Yi hesitated before answering, clearly working through the implications in real time. She said it seemed too coincidental not to be connected, especially given the timing lining up almost perfectly with the weapons transfers Bald Uncle had already flagged. If she was right, Li Shiwan wasn't just funding proxy delinquents anymore. He was actively staging resources somewhere close, positioning assets for a move that could happen at almost any moment. Ji Shang felt the frustration from earlier that morning sharpen into something closer to alarm. He asked Li Yi if she could pinpoint the warehouse's exact location. She already had. She pulled up the coordinates on her tablet, marking a spot roughly 20 minutes from the estate, tucked within an industrial zone that had mostly fallen into disuse over the past decade. Ji Shang's first instinct was to go there immediately, to confront whatever was happening before it escalated further. Li Yi caught his arm before he could act on that impulse, reminding him that walking into an unknown, potentially armed location without backup or a clear plan was exactly the kind of reckless mistake that got people killed. She suggested instead that they bring this new information directly to Bald Uncle, letting the ongoing investigation absorb this lead through proper channels rather than risking everything on impulsive action. Ji Shang reluctantly agreed, though the frustration of having concrete information without immediate authority to act on it settled uneasily in his chest for the rest of the day. Bald Uncle received the new coordinates with grim satisfaction, immediately dispatching a small team of trusted estate personnel to conduct careful surveillance on the warehouse without engaging directly. Within hours, initial reports started filtering back, confirming Li Yi's suspicions with unsettling clarity. The warehouse showed signs of recent renovation, reinforced doors and windows that didn't match its otherwise abandoned exterior. Vehicle traffic followed a consistent pattern, deliveries arriving late at night, always unloaded quickly before the vehicles departed the way they came. Most damning of all, one surveillance photo captured a face entering the warehouse through a side entrance, a face that matched, unmistakably, a senior lieutenant known to work closely under Li Shiwan's direct authority within the Fire Bear organization. This wasn't circumstantial anymore. This was a direct, physical link between Li Shiwan's inner circle and an active staging ground stocked with unknown resources, timed suspiciously close to the coalition's planned assault on Moxian territory. Zhang Hongbo called another emergency meeting that evening, this time allowing Ji Shang to sit in given the direct relevance of the new evidence to his own safety and the upcoming war effort. The atmosphere inside the meeting room felt different than Ji Shang had expected. Less like the tense uncertainty of earlier discussions, and more like the calculated stillness of men preparing to finally act, waiting only for the right trigger to justify moving against one of their own. His father laid out the situation plainly to the assembled senior members. The evidence against Li Shiwan had crossed a threshold that could no longer be ignored or handled through quiet, patient investigation alone. Weapons, staged resources, and confirmed personnel links left little room for alternative explanation. The question now wasn't whether to act, but when and how, given the added complication of the Moxian assault looming just days away. One senior member suggested delaying the war effort entirely until the internal threat had been fully neutralized, arguing that fighting battles on two fronts simultaneously invited disaster. Another countered that delaying the Moxian assault risked losing the momentum and alliance goodwill they'd worked so hard to build with Park Mingjun's faction, momentum that might not survive an indefinite postponement. Ji Shang listened to the debate unfold, understanding both positions clearly, but growing increasingly aware that whatever decision emerged would directly shape the danger he and his allies faced in the coming days. Eventually, his father settled the argument with a decision that split the difference between both concerns. The Moxian assault would proceed on schedule, since backing out now risked fracturing the coalition beyond repair. Simultaneously, a quiet but decisive move would be made against Li Shiwan's confirmed assets, starting with the warehouse itself, timed to happen just before the coalition forces moved on Moxian territory. The goal was simple in concept, complicated in execution. Neutralize Li Shiwan's staged resources before he could deploy them, ideally without alerting him to the fact that his operation had already been fully compromised, buying enough time to handle both threats without either one overwhelming the organization's attention completely. Ji Shang was assigned a role in that plan more direct than he'd expected. His father wanted him personally present during the warehouse operation, not because the mission required his specific combat skills, but because confirming Li Shiwan's betrayal with his own eyes would matter later, when the final confrontation with the traitor eventually arrived. The meeting concluded with logistics finalized for a nighttime operation 2 days later, timed carefully to avoid overlapping with any of Li Shiwan's known movement patterns. Ji Shang left the meeting with a strange, hollow calm settling into his chest, the kind that came from finally having a concrete target after weeks of shapeless anxiety. That calm didn't last uninterrupted. Walking back toward his room that night, he found Han Shu-shen waiting near the estate's outer garden, having somehow managed to gain entry despite the increased security measures now in place. He asked, more tired than surprised, how she'd gotten past the guards. She explained quietly that she'd told them she needed to deliver an urgent message, a lie that had apparently worked well enough to get her this far. She said she wouldn't have come at all if it wasn't something she felt he needed to know. Ji Shang crossed his arms, waiting for her to continue, his patience for her presence considerably thinner than it used to be. She told him Shen Jingjae's sentencing hearing had been scheduled for the following week, the combined charges from the kidnapping and prior assaults likely to keep him imprisoned for several years. She said she'd only found out because her mother worked administratively within the local court system, and the news had reached her through family channels before becoming public record. Ji Shang asked why that mattered to him now, given everything else demanding his attention. Han Shu-shen hesitated, her earlier confidence faltering slightly under his flat, unreadable gaze. She admitted, voice quieter now, that she hadn't come only to deliver news about Shen Jingjae, She'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that some part of their old connection might still be salvageable if she was patient enough, honest enough, willing to wait the way he'd once waited for her. Ji Shang felt something tighten in his chest, not quite anger, closer to a weary sadness for a version of himself that no longer existed. He told her, gently but firmly, that patience wasn't something he had much of anymore to offer anyone, least of all someone who'd once told him plainly that his gentleness bored her. He reminded her that people don't get to discard someone's best qualities and then request them back once convenience or circumstance shifted their preferences again. Growth, he told her, moved in one direction only. Han Shu Sen's eyes filled with tears, though this time she didn't argue or plead further. She simply nodded, accepting something she'd clearly been dreading to hear, and turned to leave the garden without another word. Ji Shang watched her go, feeling the last threads of his old life quietly severing themselves, one conversation at a time. 2 days later, under cover of darkness, the warehouse operation moved forward exactly as planned. Ji Shang accompanied a small strike team, led personally by Bald Uncle, moving through the industrial district with the kind of practiced silence that came from years of underworld experience among the estate's senior enforcers. The warehouse's exterior lighting had been disabled ahead of time by an advanced scout, leaving the entire structure shrouded in shadow as the team approached from multiple angles simultaneously. Bald Uncle signaled the breach, and the team moved in fast, overwhelming the 2 guards stationed at the entrance before either could raise an alarm. Inside, the warehouse revealed exactly what the surveillance reports had suggested. Crates stacked along the walls, some containing weapons still wrapped in factory packaging, others holding communication equipment far more sophisticated than anything a typical street gang would require. Ji Shang moved through the space slowly, absorbing the scale of what Li Shiwan had been quietly building. This wasn't a minor grudge or petty jealousy playing out through proxy delinquents anymore. This was infrastructure for something considerably larger, an organized effort that suggested Li Shiwan had been planning far beyond simply undermining one teenage heir's rise to power. A quick search of the warehouse's small office space turned up documents that Bald Uncle immediately flagged as significant ledgers detailing not just financial transfers but personnel assignments, a structure of loyalty being quietly assembled beneath the Fire Bear Gang's official hierarchy. Names appeared throughout those ledgers, some belonging to low-level members nobody would have suspected, others carrying weight that made Bald Uncle's expression harden considerably as he flipped through page after page. Ji Shang asked what exactly they were looking at. Bald Uncle explained, voice tight with controlled fury, that Li Shiwan appeared to have been quietly cultivating his own shadow organization within the Fire Bear ranks for years, recruiting members disillusioned with the current leadership structure, promising them better positions once he eventually took control. This wasn't a simple grudge against one heir. This was an attempted coup years in the making, one that had simply accelerated once Ji Shang's sudden rise threatened to solidify a succession Li Shiwan had apparently never intended to accept. The team worked quickly to secure the warehouse's contents, confiscating weapons and documents while leaving the physical structure largely undisturbed, careful not to alert Li Shiwan that his operation had been fully compromised before the organization was ready to move against him directly. As they prepared to leave, one of the team members flagged something troubling near the warehouse's rear exit. A partially burned document that had apparently been discarded in a small trash bin, singed but not fully destroyed. Ji Shang retrieved the fragment carefully, smoothing it out enough to make out a partial timeline scrawled in someone's handwriting. Dates, locations, and a phrase that made his stomach drop the moment he read it clearly. The fragment referenced a planned incident timed to coincide directly with the coalition's assault on Moxian High, something described only as a diversion, without further detail on what exactly that diversion would involve. Bald Uncle took the fragment from him, studying it with grim focus before pocketing it for further analysis back at the estate. The implication hung heavy over the entire team as they exited the warehouse and dispersed quietly into the night. Li Shiwan wasn't simply building resources for some distant future move. He appeared to be planning something specific, timed deliberately to exploit the chaos and divided attention that the Moxian assault would inevitably create. Whatever that diversion was meant to accomplish, it would likely unfold in just a few short days, right in the middle of what was already shaping up to be the most dangerous confrontation Ji Shang had faced since claiming his new identity. Back at the estate, the discovery sparked immediate, urgent discussion among the senior leadership. The timeline had shifted from cautious investigation into something considerably more pressing. Whatever Li Shiwan intended to do, it was coming soon, and the coalition's own carefully planned assault on Moxian territory now risked walking directly into whatever trap he'd quietly constructed. Zhang Hongbo convened yet another meeting, this one carrying an urgency that hadn't existed during earlier discussions. The decision reached was swift and decisive. Security around key figures, Ji Shang included, would be tightened considerably in the days leading up to the Moxian assault. Additional loyal personnel would be quietly positioned to monitor Li Shiwan's known associates, watching for any sign of the planned diversion mentioned in the burned fragment. Ji Shang absorbed this new layer of danger with a steadiness that surprised even himself. Weeks ago, a threat of this magnitude would have paralyzed him with anxiety. Now, it simply hardened his resolve further, another obstacle standing between him and the position he'd fought so hard to claim. He returned to Li Yi's side that same night, finding her still awake despite the late hour, tablet glowing softly as she cross-referenced Moxian's patrol patterns one final time before the assault timeline locked into place. He told her everything, the warehouse discovery, the burned fragment, the looming possibility that Li Shiwan's betrayal might collide directly with their planned assault in ways nobody could fully predict yet. Li Yi listened with the same sharp focus she brought to every tactical challenge, already working through implications before he'd finished explaining. She asked pointed questions about troop positioning, about whether the diversion might target the assault force directly or aim instead at something closer to home, like the estate itself, left more vulnerable while its strongest fighters were occupied elsewhere. Neither of them had a definitive answer. The fragment offered only a vague warning, not a detailed blueprint. All they could do now was prepare for multiple possibilities, keeping contingencies ready for whatever form Li Shiwan's move ultimately took. Li Yi reached for his hand across the scattered maps and documents, her grip firm despite the exhaustion visible in her expression. She told him, quietly, that whatever happened in the coming days, he wouldn't be facing it alone. Se Zhongxi, injured or not, would find a way to contribute. Bald Uncle's network was already tightening around every lead they had, and she herself wasn't going anywhere, regardless of how dangerous the coming week promised to be. Ji Shang felt something steady settle into his chest at her words, a warmth that stood in stark contrast to the cold calculation Li Shiwan's betrayal represented. The following day brought fresh complications. Wang Kaiyun resurfaced unexpectedly, appearing at the edge of the estate's outer perimeter with a request that immediately put the newly tightened security on alert. She claimed she had information relevant to the upcoming Moxian conflict, insisting she needed to speak with Ji Shang directly rather than relay anything through intermediaries. Ji Shang, wary given everything else currently unfolding, agreed to meet her only under Bald Uncle's watchful supervision, unwilling to risk another ambush disguised as casual conversation. Wang Kaiyun, apparently unbothered by the added security presence, explained that her connections near Moxian's periphery had picked up unusual chatter recently, delinquents from unaffiliated factions being quietly recruited for a task nobody seemed willing to specify openly. The recruitment pattern, she said, felt oddly familiar. Low-level thugs pulled together with promises of quick payment and vague instructions to remain ready for a call that hadn't come yet. Ji Shang asked if she suspected any connection to the Fire Bear gang specifically. Wang Kaiyun shrugged, admitting she didn't have concrete proof either way, only a feeling that something bigger than a simple school rivalry was quietly assembling in the shadows around this entire conflict. Bald Uncle, listening carefully throughout the exchange, exchanged a brief glance with Ji Shang that confirmed they were both thinking the same thing. This recruitment pattern matched uncomfortably well with the kind of proxy operation Li Shiwan had already demonstrated a willingness to run. Wang Kaiyun's information, whether offered out of genuine concern or some other motive Ji Shang couldn't fully parse, added another troubling thread to the tangled web closing in around the coalition's carefully planned timeline. Before leaving, she lingered a moment longer than necessary, her earlier boldness from their first encounter tempered now by something closer to genuine curiosity. She told him she'd continue watching what she could from her position near Moxian's territory, offering the information freely, without any expectation of return favor. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added that she found the version of him currently standing guarded and alert far more interesting than the reckless charm he'd shown during their first meeting, a comment that left Ji Shang uncertain how to respond before she turned and departed the estate grounds entirely. Li Yi, who'd observed the exchange from a short distance away, didn't comment directly on Wang Kaiyun's parting remark, though her expression carried an edge that suggested the rivalry between them hadn't cooled in the slightest, despite the more pressing dangers currently dominating everyone's attention. With the assault timeline now just 3 days out, preparations across all three allied factions intensified considerably. Park Mingjun's forces integrated final logistics with Jialan's delinquent ranks, weapons and equipment distributed carefully to avoid drawing unwanted attention from local authorities, who'd so far remained conveniently unaware of the underworld tension building beneath the surface of their district. Si Zhongxi, still confined to crutches but refusing to remain entirely sidelined, took on responsibility for coordinating defensive contingencies at the estate itself, working closely with Bald Uncle's security personnel to ensure that whatever diversion Li Shiwan planned wouldn't catch them completely unprepared. Ji Shang split his remaining time between final combat drills and increasingly tense strategy sessions, the weight of dual threats, external and internal, settling heavier onto his shoulders with each passing day. 2 nights before the planned assault, Bald Uncle's surveillance finally identified movement that confirmed their worst suspicions. Vehicles matching the warehouse's earlier pattern had been spotted converging near a secondary location, this one considerably closer to the estate's own perimeter than anyone had anticipated. The diversion, whatever its exact form, appeared to be assembling itself directly at their doorstep rather than somewhere further afield near the Moxian conflict zone. Ji Shang received this news standing in the estate's main hall, his father beside him, both watching the confirmed surveillance footage in tense silence. Zhang Honggo turned to his son, expression grave but steady, and told him the time for patient investigation had officially run out. Whatever Li Shiwan intended to unleash, it was coming soon, likely time to strike right as the coalition's forces moved out for Moxian territory, leaving the estate deliberately vulnerable during the exact window when its strongest defenders would be occupied elsewhere. Ji Shang felt the full weight of that realization settle into his chest. 2 battles, external and internal, both now converging toward the same narrow window of time, both demanding his full attention when he could only be present for one. His father's next words carried a finality that left no room for further debate. The assault on Moxian would proceed as planned, the coalition's momentum too valuable to sacrifice now. But Ji Shang himself would remain behind at the estate for the opening phase, trusted allies leading the initial coalition strike while he prepared to face whatever threat Li Shiwan intended to unleash on home ground. Ji Shang wanted to argue, every instinct pulling him toward standing alongside Se Zhongxi and Li Yi and Park Mingjun's forces as they marched into Moxian territory. But even through his frustration, he understood the logic. If Li Shiwan's diversion targeted the estate directly, someone with his capabilities needed to be present to meet it, regardless of how badly he wanted to prove himself on the coalition's front lines instead. That night, he found Li Yi one final time before the assault timeline locked into motion completely, explaining the shift in plans, the new role he'd been assigned protecting the estate, while she and the others marched on Moxian. Li Yi's expression tightened with obvious reluctance at the idea of facing Moxian's forces without him beside her, but she recognized the strategic necessity, even through her disappointment. She told him, voice steady despite the visible worry in her eyes, that she trusted his ability to handle whatever emerged at the estate, just as she needed him to trust her ability to hold her own alongside Si Zhongxi and the combined coalition forces during the Moxian assault itself. They stayed together late into that final night, neither willing to voice the full weight of uncertainty hanging over the coming days, choosing instead to hold on to whatever steadiness they could find in each other's presence, before everything they'd carefully planned collided head-on with everything Li Shiwan had quietly assembled in the shadows. Somewhere across the district, in an office still unaware that its warehouse operation had already been fully compromised, Li Shiwan reviewed his own final preparations with the calm confidence of a man who believed himself still hidden, still patient, still perfectly positioned to strike at the exact moment his target's guard dropped lowest. He had no idea the Firebear Gang's leadership already knew his name, his methods, and the rough shape of his intentions. He had no idea that the young heir he'd underestimated for weeks now stood forewarned, gathering his own quiet strength for a confrontation neither of them could avoid much longer. 2 fronts. 1 converging deadline. And somewhere in the gap between what Li Shiwan believed he'd hidden and what the Fire Bear gang had already uncovered, the true cost of his betrayal was about to come due, in ways that would reshape the balance of power across the entire district, far beyond a simple schoolyard rivalry. The estate settled into an uneasy quiet as the final hours before the assault ticked steadily down, every person within its walls now aware that whatever happened next would determine far more than which school controlled which patch of territory. It would determine whether the Fire Bear gang itself survived the betrayal quietly festering within its own ranks, and whether the boy who'd rebuilt himself from gentle pushover into feared heir would have anything left standing to protect once the dust finally settled. Dawn broke gray and cold over the district the morning the coalition finally moved. 3 factions gathered at the edge of Moxian territory before the sun had fully cleared the rooftops, Jialan's delinquents standing shoulder to shoulder with Chang'an's forces under Park Mingjun's steady command. Se Zhongxi positioned himself near the rear lines despite his crutches, refusing to be left entirely behind, insisting his tactical eyes mattered even if his legs couldn't carry him into direct combat. Li Yi moved among the assembled fighters with a tablet in hand, relaying final adjustments to the approach routes she'd mapped out over the past week. Her voice stayed clipped and professional, though anyone watching closely would have noticed her gaze drifting once, briefly, back toward the estate she'd left behind, toward the boy who wasn't marching beside her this time. Park Mingjun called the formation to order, and the combined forces began their advance into Moxian's territory, boots striking pavement in a rhythm that carried more weight than any ordinary schoolyard confrontation deserved. Back at the estate, Ji Shang stood at the main gate as the sun climbed higher, watching the quiet grounds with a stillness that belied the tension coiled tight beneath his ribs. Bald Uncle stood beside him, eyes scanning the perimeter with the practiced vigilance of a man who'd survived far too many ambushes to trust a calm morning at face value. Somewhere out there, Li Shiwan believed his diversion would land clean, unnoticed, until it was already too late to stop. He had built his entire plan on the assumption that nobody suspected him yet, that the young heir he'd quietly worked to undermine remained exactly as blind as everyone else. That assumption was about to cost him everything. A radio crackled at Bald Uncle's hip, a scout's voice reporting movement along the estate's northern perimeter. Vehicles approaching in a pattern that matched the warehouse's earlier signature exactly. Ji Shang felt something settle inside him, not fear, but a grim, focused readiness that had nothing left in common with the boy who once apologized to furniture. 10 years of swallowed anger had built the foundation. Weeks of hard-won strength had sharpened it into something real. Whatever Li Shiwan had planned was arriving now, and this time, nobody standing at that gate intended to be caught unprepared. Ji Shang rolled his shoulders once, feeling the weight of his father's trust and the estate's safety settle across them, and stepped forward to meet whatever came next. The war for 2 fronts had officially begun.